Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Today we are tackling 3 topics in one episode. We're talking about bullying, learning differences, and anxiety. And my guest today is a best-selling writer, researcher, advocate, and parent, Kayla Taylor. She recently published Canaries Among Us, an expose blending poignant storytelling and groundbreaking research to empower those caring for the millions of kids challenged by learning differences, bullying, and anxiety. I'm absolutely thrilled to have her here today.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Welcome to the podcast, Kayla.
Thank you so much for having me, Karen. I'm honored to be here.
I am so grateful. Thank you so much for being with me here today. You know, before we actually hit record, I was just gushing about your book because it is one that I think will resonate with so many of our listeners, so many of the families that I've worked with, that my colleagues have worked with. And it really is, like in the title, a mother's quest to honor a child's individuality. And you say, in a culture determined to negate it. And your book is Canaries Among Us. And it's just such an important book. It's moving. Obviously, the title is compelling. But for people who don't know about you and about the book, and I'm going to make sure we have a link to it in the show notes, can you talk a little bit about what made you decide to write Canaries Among Us?
Absolutely. First of all, I want to thank you for reading the book. It feels like someone bears witness every time, and I'm touched and honored. So thank you, and for your kind words about it. So I actually never saw myself as a writer. I have a background in business and strategy and finance and investing. But then my family had this experience that just rocked our world. And it included things like bullying and learning differences and anxiety. And each one is a whole bucket of issues on its own. But when they come together, they all conflate and intertwine in a way that was so confusing for me. And when I tried to talk to people about it, maybe because it's stigmatized or maybe because it's uncomfortable, people would often shut me down and, want to talk about other things or even negate what I was saying. I definitely felt like I was being gaslit a fair amount. So I started journaling, mostly just to validate what I was experiencing. Like I say, it's not actually something I'd like to do, but I felt like I was bleeding onto paper. I just had all of this emotion that I needed to put somewhere. And at the same time, I was journaling with all this emotive stuff to substantiate what I was feeling. I was also doing a ton of research. So I was the big nerd who was so confused by this all. And one of the ways I personally deal with it, confusion is I started researching. So I read all the self-help books, and then I went into the footnotes and paid $29.95 for all these medical journals, and for one little tidbit of information. Right. And it was a very time-consuming process, but it was also very enlightening, especially as I was taking notes for my research. They would often very much relate to the emotions I was feeling in my journaling. And so the writing created meaning for me in a way I hadn't really expected. And maybe the somatic process of writing, moving, I realized I'm not moving my whole body, but I was moving my arms and seeing physical things in front of me was really, really helpful. And after a few years, I got my kids to a better place. As your listeners probably know, raising unique kids is a lifelong journey. Yeah. It was never all pretty and perfect with a bow on top. But, for a long time there, I felt like I was in a deep, dark hole all by myself, with my kids next to me and nothing else. But after a while, I was able to get them to better environments. I started to feel better, and I started to peek out like a little groundhog out of this deep, dark hole. And I started to look around and see so many other families were dealing with these exact same issues. And it was surreal because they too felt so alone and so incapacitated. But I could see from my vantage point that they weren't alone. They were all right next to each other. Right. And it made me realize I had been right next to a lot of people, but alone, and they were too. And I started to feel somewhat of a moral obligation to pay it forward, because so many times in my process, I thought, why hasn't someone, am I really, I saw the data that said 20% of all kids have diagnosable learning differences. And that doesn't even include all issues that affect kids in classrooms. So arguably that number is much higher. And 20 to 30% of kids, deal with bullying, though most don't report it. Anxiety before COVID affected a third of all adolescents. And you can imagine that's only skyrocketed. Right. So all these people are dealing with these issues, but nobody was talking about it. And I wished someone had talked about it ahead of me so I could know I wasn't alone. And then I kind of felt a moral obligation to help these other families know they were not alone. And then I felt, gosh, I'm this big dork who, does all this research. But, other people, I also had the luxury of being able to do that. A lot of people don't have the time to research and that I did. And so I felt the need to intertwine that in the book, hopefully not in a boring way, but summarizing it with highlights to help empower families so that they not only know that they're alone, but they know there are things that they can do to support their children.
Absolutely. And that is one of the best reasons to write a book, is to inform and to share your personal experience. And you've kind of paired research with your personal experience, which includes many familiar feelings in terms of our community. Confusion, you talk about hope, sorrow, frustration, joy, all of it, feeling all of those things. And then you were also speaking about something that really concerns our community, is that how we treat children who don't conform, like you say, to society's expectations of normal or average. And that's a huge issue, because when we don't address their concerns, or we don't even see that the concerns are there, that they're valid, then we don't provide adequate support. And then we further contribute to the struggles that they're having. And then it moves from learning differences to learning differences plus mental health challenges, because they're not getting the support that they need.
Right. I think you might have just jumped to the punchline of this whole interview, because so often what we do is we have this contrived notion about what a kid should be. So we try and stuff them in a box. And when we don't, we try and fix the kid, right? Yes. We remediate, we do all this other stuff to fix the kid. But perhaps what we should be doing is looking around at the environment, the context, our norms, and saying, is the kid really broken? Or is our system broken? Why do we have this contrived notion of what normal is? I could give you many examples, but, right now we have a norm where if you're athletic, if you do well in math, you could probably add a few things on top, then you're a good kid, right? But what if you're really musical? What if which is, amazing. What if you have amazing artistry and you can contribute to the world in a way that helps people see new things and connect dots in new ways? That is not valued, right? I mean, arguably, I could argue that it helps the world even more, but we have these contrived notions of what is acceptable. And unfortunately, a lot of kids suffer because of it. And I would say not just the kid isn't the only one who's suffering. Of course, the family is too, but we all suffer. Like, we strip the fun and the joy out of life when we make it so austere about what is okay and what is not. I think we really take the fun out of the world. And so my hope is that we can learn to not just tolerate differences. There's a lot of talk about tolerance and how good that is, but do we really want to just tolerate one another? Wouldn't it be more to celebrate? And enjoy one another? I just find what, a lot of people call quirky. I find those things more interesting than the standard bell-shaped curves of what's acceptable. So I'm hoping we can rethink the way we look at kids and our world.
Absolutely. Now, your title, Canaries Among Us, how did you choose that title?
Right. Well, you're probably aware that back at the end of the 1900s, coal miners took canaries down into coal mines not just because they had a beautiful song, but because they had a special sense. They were highly sensitive to toxins in the air. So they noticed if a canary stopped singing, the miners knew that they needed to flee the mine or they might be poisoned by carbon monoxide. And I loved this analogy because I figured out early on, and it's in the early chapters of my book, that my child is highly sensitive. Mm-hmm. And these days, kids who are sensitive are not treated well. Their sensitivity is frowned upon. These kids are considered weak, overly emotional, maybe even somewhat pathetic. But kids and people who are highly sensitive, there's actually, several doctors, including Elaine Aron, have studied this trait. And it's been shown to link to actual neural wiring that shows that certain people who are highly sensitive, their fMRI scans look different. Their brain wiring is different. They process things more deeply in the brain. And this leads to amazing things like you notice things that other people don't notice. People with high sensitivity often have higher compassion, more aware of others around them. So they're these great traits, but they're frowned upon. And so I like the analogy of the canary because it makes us think twice about immediately assuming that because someone's sensitive, that they're not worthy. Mm-hmm. And I should say, given your world, as I moved on, for me, the analogy applied to more than just sensitivity. Mm-hmm. There are so many things we diagnose kids for, or we pathologize kids for, that really have amazing traits associated with them. Mm-hmm. So, for example, dyslexia. Yes, kids with dyslexia and people have wider visual perception modes, which can make reading harder. And not all kids with dyslexia are all the same. But studies have shown that kids with dyslexia also are more able to notice the bigger picture. They connect dots that other people don't see. They have stronger social skills on average, higher creativity on average. And so if we just look at the kid's weakness, we miss so much about that child. We basically don't allow that child to be their best self, but also we don't benefit from those amazing traits by being associated with that child. I could say the same thing about ADHD. I could say the same thing about autism. For example, kids with autism, yes, they have trouble with certain social skills, but they also recognize patterns that others don't recognize. They demonstrate higher levels of honesty, focus, sensory awareness, concern for justice, fairness. And so just to assume that autism is a weakness versus, a different way of being that has many wonderful traits associated, would be a huge travesty, is a huge travesty for our communities. And so I just feel like the canary symbolizes that so well.
Absolutely. And you just described that so beautifully. And it really speaks to this whole idea of really having a strength-based approach, which we've talked about here when we're looking at kids who are different in the ways that they think, the ways that they learn, the ways that they experience the world. And oftentimes, as a clinical neuropsychologist, we're trained to focus on those things that are weaker, those areas of struggle. But over time, I've learned, and many of my colleagues have learned, is that we have to be able to identify and really hone in on the talents and the strengths and the things that kids enjoy and doing, because that's going to bring them joy. That's going to increase their, self-esteem, their self-awareness, their motivation, their engagement. And it's such an important piece that's often missed and left out of the equation.
Right. Karen, I couldn't agree with you more. And, I've heard a lot of neuropsychologists take the path you've taken, and often because maybe their own child gets diagnosed and they're on the other side of the table and they realize how painful the process is to be stripped down to a label that recognizes weaknesses and not strengths. I also think we have a problem that what and what you've been trained to understand is not generally understood.
Right.
So, a lot of teachers who, are amazing people, and they've gone into this profession arguably because they want to support and help children and they believe in them. But I did a lot of research that shows we're actually not equipping them with the tools and information they need to support the broad variety of learning that happens in their classroom. You've probably read a great report called Forward Together by Understood and NCLD.
Yes.
Yeah, which shows that only 17% of teachers feel very well prepared to teach students with just mild to moderate learning differences. So they feel overwhelmed and under-supported. And unfortunately, what happens is when people don't understand what's going on, ignorance breeds judgment. So 1 in 3 view learning differences or attention issues as laziness. So this perfectly capable kid who's trying so hard, often the analogy of a duck with legs paddling under the water is used. But when they're not achieving in the way we expect them to, people assume they're lazy or stupid, which, is not true. That diagnoses are only given when kids are more intelligent than their classroom performance shows. So these are smart kids. And as I've discussed before, there are a lot of amazing traits that are, show great cognition. But when we demean those, we don't see their intelligence. And 1 in 4 believe ADD and ADHD is a result of bad parenting. So there's so much judgment that happens when we have this lack of awareness and of understanding. And I feel like we're really failing our teachers when we don't equip them with the information that you have. I'm sure you've been in schools, and it's, you could probably tell many stories about how it's a struggle to people know the language of strength-based. We all know that's good. I think when we don't impart our leaders in school systems with the tools they need and the knowledge they need, it's very hard to translate that language to actual practices that support the children. And I'm guessing you see that all the time.
I do. And I think this kind of loops back to what you said at the beginning about the fact that our systems need to change. And it's not only our education systems, it's our healthcare system. Because I know when I do an evaluation of a child and I create a super bill for these parents so that they can get reimbursed by their insurance company, they want to know, the insurance company says, what is the impairment? That is the words that they're using. And so in order for the parents to get reimbursed, in order for them to be able to access intervention through their healthcare system, we have to document an impairment. So that's the language that we're using. Those are the forms I'm getting for the insurance company. And even in schools, for kids to be able to get the support that they need from schools, the schools have to identify the child as having, a significant weakness, not being able to access the curriculum. And so all the language that we're using, it's like we have to use because the systems tell us this child will not get services unless you use this language.
Right. I mean, the irony is huge, right? So parents come to you because they want to support their children and validate them and even vindicate them, right? They're desperate for support and understanding. But then the process we take them on is not one of validation or vindication. Instead, it's a process of pathology where we diagnose them with disorders, deficiencies, and as being dysfunctional. And only by doing that are we saying, okay, now we'll make this classroom accessible to you.
Right.
I mean, versus if you just started from the outset and said, okay, not everybody is a cookie cutter shape. Not everybody learns the exact same. We're going to make this environment accessible from the beginning so that everybody feels a sense of belonging and empowered to learn. Then you wouldn't have to go through this demeaning process of being told you're less than. But as you know, in your effort to support kids, you have to jump through those hoops to pathologize highly capable children. It's backward. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And even when we do that, kids fall through the cracks. And before we jumped on the call and recorded rather, I was just thinking about that parent in your book that you talk about who is alarmed that she's just learning that her child who is entering high school has dyslexia and that nothing was picked up. And she says in the book, the diagnosis explains so much, but educators told her, wait it out, be patient, it'll click for him. And it never did. And she's angry. And I can't tell you how many parents I have seen who are bringing in their 7th grader, their 9th grader for the same reason. That, there's so many points where we can improve the systems that we have to not just identify and give a diagnosis, but to provide an understanding of why this child was struggling, and then providing the support that's needed in order to help that child thrive and to really minimize the chances that this child is going to have self-concept issues, anxiety related to being in the classroom setting. There's so much more work that needs to be done.
Right. You're hitting it on a lot of the systemic issues, and you could probably speak to this more than I can because you're living it every single day. I lived it as an N of one family, but you live it with so many families, and you've hit on a lot of issues. So as we've talked about, there's a lack of understanding to be able to identify kids' differences, but also the incentives are messed up. So if schools identify kids as having a learning, in quotes, disorder or deficiency, right? Then they need to allocate more resources. So this becomes a cost to them. So I've seen heads of learning who have the incentive to deny very real, very obvious learning differences. I mean, I'm picturing certain kids in my head where there's just no doubt on anybody's mind that this kid does not fit in a mold and needs extra supports or different supports, and was denied categorically and not all heads of learning are this way, but they do exist. And this one was, tasked with the budget. And so just said no basically to everything. People had to hire basically lawyers and people to come in with them to advocate for their kid. But that's expensive, right? And what about the families who can't afford that? They just get immediate denials. You've also talked about another systemic issue about, everything's fine. And the problem is the system makes, if your child is performing at average, then you're denied. But the problem is average doesn't mean your child is performing to the best of their ability. And of course, there are many different ways that you can be. All of us are average at some things, below average at others, and above average at others, right? But when you put everybody on one bell-shaped curve, kids who have like a great strength in one area that can compensate for a large weakness in another area, they look average, but that child is not being allowed to be their best self, and can often get very frustrated with themselves. So for example, you've probably seen things like, if a kid has slow processing, right? But, highly capable in other areas, like their ability to master knowledge is extremely high, but they'll come across as average, and that child is getting frustrated because they know inside they can do more, and that leads to all the mental health issues you're talking about. Or teachers might think they look lazy because the teacher can sense that the kid can do more, but they're not. But there's another area that's worth considering, and that is our system basically, in order to get any sort of accommodations, and a lot of them really don't cost much money, right? It's just being aware that there's different types of learners in the room. But if a child performs at average, then they're not given accommodations. But average is not necessarily, it basically doesn't help kids be their best self. And kids who are really, really struggling might test as average. So for example, a kid who has a great strength in one area, genius level strength in one area, might be able to compensate for a real weakness, say, for example, by slow processing or something. And so that child will look average, but inside there's a lot of turmoil and frustration that leads to anxiety. And the teacher can probably get frustrated because that teacher can see the kid is capable of more, but maybe feels the kid is being lazy. So, the standard of basically having every kid perform at average does not help kids be their best selves or, help them learn really because of all this onset of anxiety and other problems. So I think we really need to think systemically about how we decide which kids are allowed to have accommodations. Really, it would make more sense for all, to have accommodations available for anybody who needs them from the beginning, not to need to be identified or diagnosed first. And to understand that some kids will perform above average in some areas and some below average in other areas. And just because someone hits average, that everything is okay. I mean, we really want more for our kids than just to be average, on a bell-shaped curve. That harkens back to, and we can talk to, when our education system was put in place at the turn of the 20th century with a second industrial revolution, between the 19th and 20th century, at the second industrial revolution, when Taylorism was all the rage, and we're trying to put kids on assembly lines. But standardized tests and bell-shaped curves and averages really are not the ways to teach our children.
Right. I mean, that is just something that I feel very strongly about because I see it all the time. And that's why you have kids being identified in 7th grade and in high school, because they've been able to compensate, like you're saying. And I see that all the time with these amazing strengths that they have, but it's at an emotional cost. It's at a cognitive cost to them. And we really do them a disservice when we try to fit them into this box.
It's also at a cost to society. I mean, think of all these amazing strengths that we aren't allowing to shine, right? Because we're having these kids be average. So, a few people can escape this, but most don't, right? I mean, you could say that pretty much every scientist in history that you can name was probably somewhere on the autism spectrum, right? Sir Isaac Newton, Einstein, Darwin, Curie, Fisher, Warhol, a lot of other people. But a lot of them did not do well in school or even had to drop out of school because schools didn't support them. So think of the number of kids that are dropping out of school today or aren't being welcomed in school today or feeling less than in school today when they have amazing gifts they could offer the world, and we're not letting them.
And, I think that one of the things you talk about when we do that is that we're right now we're in the middle of a mental health crisis, and we actually are contributing to that problem by all the things that we're discussing right now. And I'm wondering if that's the reason why you discuss not just learning differences in your book, but you discuss learning differences, mental health challenges like anxiety, and you also discuss bullying, which I think is really important because we know that kids who learn and think differently are at greater risk for bullying.
Right. They say, I believe the number is 45% of kids with a learning difference are bullied each year. So, if you take a number of years, that number only creeps higher in terms of the percentage of kids overall who are bullied. Yeah, it was really confusing to me because when I was going through the process myself, the people around me were siloing these issues and weren't allowing me to consider them together. And the conflating effects are significant. I even found, interesting when I was considering publishing this book, a lot of the agents and publishers told me, I was trying to tackle too much. This either needed to be a mother's story or provide research, which to me, that felt a little annoying, you're speaking to mothers, don't worry, they're pretty little heads with the data. I found that hugely demeaning. And I happen to know, many parents are very capable and even, want and are craving the knowledge. But also I was told you should write a book on bullying or learning differences or anxiety, but not all together. That's just too much. And that frustrated me, because, even angered me a little bit, because what was so confusing was the conflation of them all. It felt like there was this huge mass of like spaghetti in my head, and I just couldn't understand it all. And only by researching these issues individually and then considering them juxtaposed on top of one another, did all those strands in my head start to comb out and align. And it's funny, a lot of the lessons learned in bullying, for example, are very consistent with the lessons learned in how you treat kids with anxiety. And, as you know, because you've read the book, I go on to other issues about compassion and repair and belonging and justice. And it was amazing to me as I was, studying empathy, for example, how consistent the lessons learned were with bullying and every other thing I was studying. So to me, it made no sense to isolate the issues when there's a broader picture to be understood. And that's the story I was trying to tell. And I hope I did. That was my goal.
You did. You really did, because there is so much overlap. And I mean, you write, and this just really jumped out at me. You write that the targeted children, and these are the children who are bullied, are shy, sensitive, poor, non-athletic, anxious, hyperactive, socially awkward, or otherwise distinct. And then you also talk about the aggressors, home in on those distinctions, like sharks circling prey, often exacerbating pre-existing insecurities and traumas.
Right. So it's probably worth talking about the definition of bullying here, because a lot of people don't know what bullying is, so they have a hard time identifying it. And bullying is the act of repeatedly and intentionally causing physical or emotional harm to a person with less power. Right. And the reason I mention that now is because you're talking about all these stigmatized differences, right? That people are marginalized for. Fully capable, wonderful people, but because of like awkward and contrived social norms aren't considered acceptable,
right.
are marginalized, so therefore they have less power. And so they're the ones that are the easy targets for bullying, unfortunately. And only through identifying those power imbalances and, showing humanity about the way we treat people and that we all are worthy and we all deserve our own inherent dignity, only by recognizing that are we able to really diminish bullying. And you mentioned a lot of those social reasons that make people maybe more targets. But there are others. Like some of the highest rates of bullying are for racial minorities, people in the LGBTQIA communities, and people with disabilities. As we mentioned, kids with learning differences. But really, anyone deemed different. I've had people write me about how kids who wear glasses or kids with speech impediments. I mean, really anything that's considered, and I put in finger quotes here, outside the norm, are targets often.
They are. And I think, and I know for families, it's very emotional. It's very frustrating because particularly if you have a child who's already struggling with these learning differences, to then on top of that be the victim of bullying is just it's like this incredulous thing that can be happening to your child.
Right. Well, it especially becomes incredulous because then the anxiety piles on top.
Right.
And then when you're trying to get help, one of the most frustrating things that can happen is the people around you say things like, "Oh, isn't bullying just a rite of passage? It happened to all of us." Or, "Oh, your kid's just being too sensitive," or "You're being a helicopter parent. You just need to chill out." And the assumption is that the norm, which might be aggressive, is definitely demeaning, is okay. And the problem is the child that is being targeted. So as a parent, it strips you of any sort of agency or any sort of power, and it's mind bending because I was thinking, wait, we can all agree bullying's wrong here, right? Like bullying's wrong. We all agree. And people would agree to that. But in the moment, the experience of many families is that their experience is not validated and they are basically victim shamed. Oh, your kid's being too sensitive and you're being a helicopter. You're a hypervigilant parent who just needs to chill out. And that leads to a whole other set of, this will sound like a big word, but I've studied it a lot. We can get into it, but another form of trauma. It's, like this, what I learned is called institutional betrayal. So it can hurt once and it hurt a lot to be injured. And actually the bullying experts assert that bullying is actually a form of victimization. It's not a rite of passage. It has lifelong effects, which we can get into. But so here your child has been victimized and is hurt. And then when the institution doesn't support you, then it basically normalizes. And at first it felt like, okay, these few kids are behaving poorly, but then it starts to feel like, oh my gosh, the whole institution is okay with my child being mistreated. Is there any, and it starts to make people wonder, is there any humanity in the world? Like, is there any common sense here? Like, this is wrong, right? Why can't people, break ranks and admit that this is wrong? So it's mind bending and very delegitimizing. And I wanted to talk about that whole set of issues because the consequences are serious.
They really are. And just hearing about, those concerns of parents being negated, being minimized, it's incredibly frustrating, particularly for a parent who is at the same time having to send your child to this place that is anxiety provoking, where they are being bullied. And then not feeling like you are getting the support that you need to provide the safety that your child needs on a daily basis. So what are some kind of, I know this is probably a whole other episode. As we're talking, I'm thinking we should probably just do another whole episode on, the best ways for parents to prevent and respond to bullying. But if you had some takeaways in terms of your experience, I mean, you talk in your book, and it's kind of, I think you open it up with, your child's coming to you and saying that the kid started an I Hate Hannah club.
Right.
And as a parent, hearing that and feeling your child's pain, there's no explanation in terms of, it's hard to even describe what that does to a parent and to know that your child is hurting in that way.
Right. Yeah. So, my child ended up crawling into ball, not being able to get out of bed. This child who loves school and loves learning and is highly curious, wouldn't get out of bed. So my heart ached for my child. And the teacher was very empathic. But in this case, the head of school, it felt to me like the head of school was more concerned about reputation and even control. So he wanted to manage things behind closed doors in his own office. And he didn't want to have any sort of protocols about how to handle bullying, how to prevent bullying, what to do, how to respond when it occurs. So it was all this very nebulous thing. And we had nothing to hold on to when we needed some action taken. Even though the teacher was supportive, the head of school wasn't. And I think the head of school, it felt like he was also really worried about reputation. He actually said that there's no such thing as bullying in elementary school. It's just not age appropriate. It's just not typical. And it felt like he really wanted to present this beautiful image of this amazing school that, bred beautiful, kind children. But the problem is just denying bullying doesn't make it go away. And one of my favorite research findings was when I read, and multiple people have said this, but one researcher said specifically that he would be more worried about a school that documented no incidences of bullying than one that documented many. Because bullying obviously happens everywhere. It's even age appropriate. These kids are, testing power boundaries. Some of them are really struggling with things at home, and they're bringing their aggression and hostility and frustration to school, right? So it happens in this age, but when we don't acknowledge what is happening, we, miss huge opportunities to really have authentic communities that truly are kind and limit bullying versus, what I refer to as like the school with the poster on the wall that has the one-off assembly once a year, but then really does nothing systemic to really prevent bullying.
Absolutely. And, I love that you've dived into the research in your book, and I really want parents who are listening to this episode to really pick up, and for educators as well, to pick up this book, because there's so much that we can learn about how we can support students who think and learn differently, students who are experiencing anxiety, students who are bullied. I mean, you are advocating for a world where kids who are different, like you say, are not just tolerated, they are celebrated along with their peers. Right. And I think near the end of the book, you wrote that it's the small acts of kindness that bring on the emotions now.
Right. I think, and I've heard this from a lot of people who've dealt with really hard things in their lives. My friends who have dealt with, sexual assault in school or racial prejudice or, some very hard things throughout their life. I found that those were the people who often demonstrated more empathy for my situation. And yes, my situation was very different, right? And the consequences very different. But the people I think who have experienced hard things, the research shows actually, sorry, I'm the big dork, but they can do one of two things. Like they can wall that off and when they see other people in pain, it reminds them of their own pain and it's too hard to touch. So, they just advise other people to chill out. Or they remember how that feels and they are are emotive and empathic, and they reach out and they are compassionate and help the other people. And so I found that the people who were most supportive and understanding were unfortunately people who have dealt with really hard things in their life, but therefore they had the capacity to be more caring. And to bring it back to your point, I think they also notice kind acts more. They appreciate small beauties more. And maybe it's, people who are highly sensitive too, back to that trait we were talking about earlier.
Right.
But yeah, if we can value, if we can legitimize people's experience so that we can learn from them and appreciate different traits like sensitivity, that would be great. Often what happens is people who have been victimized and hurt, they're treated like damaged goods. Like, oh, I can't trust your point of view because you've been hurt and you're probably too emotional about this. So let's go talk to someone who has no experience in this area and let's have them advise us on how to handle it, which of course is just ridiculous. Like really the people who should be, we should be looking to for wisdom are the people who've lived the experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, like you're saying, we need to validate experiences that many of our children, many of our families have had. And then really move towards understanding, recognizing strengths, as well as areas where kids need to find support or need support, and then celebrate these differences. And like you were saying at the beginning, we're coming full circle. We need more people in the world with empathy, with compassion, and who can, show those small acts of kindness to each other. Right.
Yeah, I mean, celebrating people who really step forward and maybe say the thing that's hard to say, who step out of line to say that's wrong, or I'm celebrating this thing that's different or unique. If we can really shine a spotlight on children who are making an effort to be a little different, that would be amazing.
Absolutely.
A big lesson for me too, I've learned is, my kids have taught me a lot. We all assume we're here to teach our kids, but through raising my kids, I've learned all these lessons we've been talking about. And, I'll admit I was once, I did what society taught me. If someone behaved differently, I thought they were weird or strange. And, I think we as adults can all think back to our elementary school and remember the kids who didn't fit in a box. We didn't have diagnoses back then. But we called them strange and we called them weird, and we probably didn't ask to sit next to them at the lunch table, right? And I feel so awful about that now. I was talking with my dad the other day, who's nearing 80, and he still remembers, he grew up, in the 50s, where on weekends they all went to like the one screen movie house, right? And he remembers that there was a kid in the front row with Tourette's. And obviously we now know not all people with Tourette's are the same or behave the same. But this one did do what a lot of people expect Tourette's to do, which is swear at inconvenient times. So this poor kid who had no friends, had nothing to do, went to the movie house and kind of sat near the front by himself while, my dad, who's highly empathic, a very kind person, but he and his friends would giggle and laugh at this kid in one of the front rows. And to this day, my dad's 80. This still, I could see brings tears to his eyes. And I too can think of experiences where I wish I had been made aware so I could be kinder to those people. And recognize everybody's inherent right to dignity. And I'm hoping we can teach our kids that now. And one of the small ways I do that is I have tried to limit strip words like weird or strange from my vocabulary, because I don't want to role model that for my kids. And when I hear my kids using them, I use it as an opportunity to help them recognize the beauty in people's differences versus demeaning them for them.
Kayla, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your experience, for sharing this book with us, because I think that it is going to just, again, break down some walls that are there. It's not going to be over time, but I think this is just another small step in moving towards, again, a world where kids who think and learn differently, are celebrated, are validated, and that we're kinder to kids and adults who don't fit that mold. So again, thank you so much for telling your story. Thank you for being here. If listeners want to learn more about you and your work, where can we send them?
Well, Karen, thank you so much for having me and for all the work you are doing to promote kindness and awareness and empathy, among all of your listeners. And I'm sure they're here because they care about these things. So I think there's great hope for all of us. So my book is Canaries Among Us. It can be purchased, most places you buy books. I'd like to plug the independent bookstores like bookshop.org, but of course it's on Amazon and anywhere else you want. And there's more information, including some resources that people have found useful at Kayla Taylor Writes with an S.com, KaylaTaylorWrites.com.
Wonderful. And I'll be sure to put links to that website and to where they can get your book in the show notes. Thank you again. It has been such a pleasure talking to you.
Karen, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.